Please stand for the gospel reading. So we've had the Transfiguration reading from Luke's gospel this morning that Mary Kate read for us. I want to read the one from Matthew. They're very similar. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then, there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw nobody except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen, until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The disciples asked him, "Why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. Words inspired by God. I was late for 2 of the most important funerals of my life. Really late. So late, in fact, that I missed both of them. The first one by 6 weeks, and the second one by 2 weeks. The first one was in 1965. My maternal grandmother, whom I called Nana, who had raised me from age 6 to age 18 when I went to the seminary, she died on the 13th of April in 1965. But I was a novice in the seminary at the time, and I wasn't allowed home for the funeral. I didn't get home until June, so I missed her funeral by 6 weeks. 10 years later, on the 6th of August in 1975, my paternal grandmother died, and she had raised me for the first 6 years of my life. But I was in Kenya, and I just got home 2 weeks later, having finished my first tour of duty, my 3-year stint in Kenya as a missionary priest. So I missed her funeral by 2 weeks. But my maternal grandmother had died just at Easter, and my other grandmother had died on the feast of the Transfiguration. So it's always very easy for me to remember their anniversaries. And today I want to talk about this. My paternal grandmother, whom I call Big Mammy, died on the 6th of August in 1975, the feast of the Transfiguration. And I want to talk about the Transfiguration today. And I'm going to make 4 main points. The first one, I'm going to talk about Moses and the Exodus. Secondly, what did Jesus know? Thirdly, what really happened on Mount Tabor? And fourthly, the transfiguration of our times. Now, it seems like it's a strange place to start to talk about transfiguration, but you can't understand transfiguration until you understand Jesus' cosmology. And you can't understand Jesus' cosmology unless you understand the character of Moses. And that's what I'm going to start with. I'm going to start with Moses. Very few Catholics have ever read the Bible. We weren't encouraged to. In fact, we were dissuaded from ever doing it. But if you ever cracked open the Bible and sat down and actually read it, and if you read, for instance, just the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, called the Pentateuch, the 5 books, or sometimes in Hebrew it's called Torah. And allegedly they were written by Moses. But if you actually walk yourself through the first 5 books of the Bible, you realize very, very quickly that Moses was a genocidal maniac, and I'm choosing my words really, really wisely, who went on a 40-year rampage in the Sinai desert, genocidally wiping out every tribe that the Israelites came across on the instructions of God. Again and again, and there's this phrase that as he sends the armies against particular tribes, he says, kill every man, every woman, every child, every ox, every ass. And the phrase that's used very often is, kill everything that breathes. Kill everything that breathes. And when you total up the figures in the course of 40 years, you're talking about literally hundreds of thousands of human beings, not to mention the animals, who were destroyed by this maniac. On the command of this cosmic, divine sociopath that he called God. This God who wiped out all of creation because he was really upset with what was going on planet Earth. A God who killed all the firstborns of the Egyptians. This was the God that Moses served. Now the good news is Moses never existed. And the very good news is this God that Moses allegedly worshipped never existed either. And the really good news is the Exodus actually never happened. So I've gone into this in much more detail in a previous homily, so I'm just going to hit some highlights at this stage. There is zero evidence for the historicity of the character called Moses. In fact, Moses is never mentioned anywhere outside of the Bible until about 950 years after his alleged death, when the Greeks overthrew the land of Israel and began to delve into Jewish literature. They mentioned the name of this guy called Moses. There's no evidence for him whatsoever in any other history in Egypt or any place else except in the Bible. So Moses is a fictitious character. And the Exodus never happened. There's zero evidence that 2 million Israelites escaped from Egypt, spent 40 years in the desert, and all of them died. According to the Bible, there were only 2 people who left Egypt who actually arrived in the Promised Land, Caleb and Joshua. Everybody else died in the desert because God was upset with them, as well as the hundreds of thousands of people they killed. So the Sinai desert should be littered with the bones of animals and human beings. When in 1967 the Six-Day War broke out and a whole bunch of Arab armies attacked Israel, and Israel was very successful, pushed them back really quickly within 6 days, and they captured the Sinai Peninsula. And droves of Israeli archaeologists descended on the Sinai looking for evidence of the Exodus. And they scoured it with all the most modern equipment. There wasn't a single human bone found in the desert. No evidence whatsoever that there had ever been an Exodus or that over 2 million people had died in this place. So the Exodus gratefully never happened, and Moses gratefully never existed, and the God who allegedly instructed Moses to genocide is a fiction. This God is a projection of the human shadow. It's a God whom we have created in our image and likeness. So to understand then Moses in the Exodus, you have to understand something about mythology. So mythology is the archived wisdom of a culture. But it's framed, it's put in parable form and story form and proverb form. It is not meant to be factual, and it is not meant to be historical. It is meant to be inspirational and transformative. It's meant to be stories where you try to understand your own history as a community, you try to understand your own destiny as a community, and you try to understand your own relationship with God as a community. That's what mythology does. And it does it in every single tradition. I found it in Irish mythology, I found it in African mythology, I find it in European mythology, and I find it in the Jewish mythology. It's a way of trying to make sense of your history, make sense of your destiny, and make sense of your relationship with God. So it's an effort to try to band people together. Now, in actual fact, when they invented the story of Moses, which was about 600 years after his alleged lifespan, it was invented about 600 BCE. And it was invented at a time when 10 of the tribes of Israel had been annihilated in a real genocide. They're never heard of again. And the last 2 tribes of Israel, the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin, are about to be exiled to Babylon, and it looks like there's going to be further genocidal disaster. And that's when they invent the character of Moses. They need a hero figure that they can look up to. They need a story, And they need to invent a story of their origins that show that in the past they had successfully escaped genocide themselves. And this, in fact, is something, unfortunately, that the Jewish race has been subjected to again and again and again, even down into our own times. So they were facing, actually, the possibility of real genocidal extinction themselves. So they invent a hero figure that they can look up to. And they invent a creation story of their tribe that gives them cohesion. And they put together 613 precepts that can build some form of unity and community. Most of these precepts are borrowed from other more ancient traditions, like the Code of Hammurabi from 1754 BCE. So they're pulled together 613 precepts that give them some kind of cohesion as a group. They invent a history and a hero that can allow them to survive the Babylonian exile. And it worked. It worked perfectly. It allowed these people to survive the Babylonian exile. It allowed them to survive many, many different exiles since then. They were being thrown out of Spain in 1492 and other parts of Europe as well. So it worked beautifully. But we have to understand that this is myth in the proper sense of myth. Stories made up to kind of give us a sense of ourselves, a sense of our destiny, and a sense of our relationship with God. It is not meant to be factual or historical. It is meant to be inspirational and transformative. So there is the function of Moses, and there is the function of Exodus. So that's my first point. My second point then is, so what then did Jesus know? What was Jesus' own cosmology? In the early 1970s, I was the headmaster of a high school in Kenya. It was called Kipchimchim Harambee Secondary School. And it was at the western end of the Great Rift Valley province in Kenya. And I taught math, and I taught physics, and I taught scripture in the school, as well as being the headmaster there. And I remember at one stage, we were working through Luke's gospel. And we come across this story. It's in Luke chapter 2, and there's two little pieces to it. The first one is the presentation of the infant Jesus in the temple at age 8 days old. And we were told that he goes back to Nazareth with his parents after this, and he's obedient to them. And he grows in wisdom and age and grace in the sight of God and in the sight of the human community. And then a little bit later in the same chapter, there's the story where he gets lost in the temple at age 12. And his parents are looking for him for 3 days, and they're freaking out. And his mother calls him to order. He really chastises him. And we're told at the end of chapter 2, he went back to Nazareth, and he was obedient to them, and he continued to increase in wisdom and age and grace and strength. And we go through this passage. And the students have no problem accepting that Jesus could have, grown in age. One time he was 8 days old, then he was 12 years old, then he was 30 years old. That was no problem. They had no problem accepting that he could have grown in size. He was born as an 8-pound baby, and then he became a 150-pound male. So they could no problem accepting that. But they balked completely at the idea that Jesus could have grown in wisdom, or that he could have grown in grace. They said to me, well, he's God. He's the only Son of God, in fact. He's God incarnate. So he was omniscient. He knew everything. So what does it mean to say that he could increase in wisdom? How could he increase if he was omniscient and he was already God? How could he grow in grace? Grace is the divine life force inside in any manifested element. How could that increase in Jesus, who is God himself? So I started teasing, playing around with him. And I said, do you think Jesus spoke fluent Kipsigis? Kipsigis was the local language. Or do you think that Jesus spoke Japanese? Or did he speak Portuguese? And do you think that Jesus knew the height of Kilimanjaro, which is on the boundary between Kenya and Tanzania? Could he name the elevation of Kilimanjaro? Or do you think that Jesus could solve a quadratic equation, x equal to minus b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a? Or do you think that Jesus could understand Boyle's law in chemistry? And they're studying all these things with me. And so I begin to say, we have to understand what it means for Jesus to be incarnated as a human being. He wasn't God pretending to be human. He was God as a human, just as each one of us is God as a human. And so he's operating, with the limitations of being a human person. He's operating within that. And so Jesus has to grow. Jesus has to make mistakes. And indeed, he did make mistakes. And I would just want to point out two of them that really upset me when I fully understood them. The first one is a story that you find in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 15. And Jesus is on vacation. He leaves the land of Israel. He goes into Syrophoenicia with the disciples for a break. But as he's walking through a village, a woman recognizes him. And she starts running up the street after him because her little daughter is seriously ill. And she's calling him Son of David, in other words, Israeli or Jewish man. Please help me. My little daughter's at home and she's dying. And Jesus just ignored her. And the guys are getting, kind of worried. They say, look, everybody's coming out of their huts looking at us. They think maybe, did we rob this woman or something? And Jesus says a very strange thing. He says, I was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And he continues to ignore her. And she ran up in front of him and grabbed his feet and she said, please, my little daughter is dying at home. And very rudely, Jesus says, I can't take the food from the children and throw it to the dogs. That was an extraordinary, insulting thing for Jesus to say. But the woman was better than him. The woman's love for her own daughter was stronger than the insult she had just received. So she played with his own metaphor. And she said, you know what? Sometimes the little puppies run in and they take the food that fell off the children's table. That's all I want. And suddenly God smacked Jesus upside the head and said, wake up, dude. You're not just being sent to the lost sheep of Israel. And this daughter is as important to me as you are to me. Give her what she wants. And the end of that story, Jesus says he was amazed at the faith of this woman. This woman grew him. There's another story you'll find in chapter 4 of John's Gospel. And it's a story where Jesus and his disciples are moving through Samaria, which was very, very hostile to the Israelis. And Jesus sends him into the town to get some provisions, and he's sitting by a well. And a woman comes to draw water, and he engages her in conversation. And at one stage he says to her, go home and bring back your husband. And she says, I don't have a husband. And he says, you're bloody right, you don't have a husband. You've had several of them. And the guy you're with right now is not your husband. Now, who gave Jesus permission, to kind of judge this woman? Total stranger to him. And then she says, I see, she kind of tries to change the goalposts. And she says, oh, I see that you're a prophet. So our people worship here on Mount Gerizim, and you Jews, you worship in Jerusalem. And then he says this really pompous, asinine thing. He says, you Samaritans worship what you don't understand. We worship what we do understand, because salvation, after all, is from the Jews. So at that stage, I want to slap him upside the head. But that he's still growing. He's still prejudiced. He still feels like there's only one route to God, it's the Jewish way, and that this woman is worshipping the wrong version of God. And moreover, he's judging her. But he learned from that as well. There's a story just 4 chapters later in John's Gospel, in chapter 8, where a woman who'd been caught in the act of adultery is brought before the crowd, and they're ready to stone her. And Jesus arrived on the scene. He said, hold on a minute. Let the person among you who's without sin throw the first stone. And then he goes down to the ground, he starts writing on the ground. And one by one, everybody's looking, holy God Almighty, he just busted me. And they start disappearing. And finally, Jesus is left with the woman, and he says to her, has nobody condemned you? She says, nobody, Lord. He says, neither do I. Go and don't commit this sin anymore. A totally different Jesus, just 4 chapters on, because he had learned from the Samaritan woman. So there's Jesus' trajectory. He's learning and he's growing. He was a complete human being. He was God incarnate, which means he wasn't just God pretending to be human. He was God who was experiencing life as a human. So sometimes he was afraid. I think the mother of all panic attacks happened in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before he died. He was so filled with anxiety and fear that he literally sweated blood. And the next day on the cross, he would call out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you abandoned me? He was a real person. He accepted totally his humanity. So he continued to try to grow. Now, part of what he would have accepted then, he would have accepted the myth of Moses, and he would have accepted the myth of the Exodus. That would have been part of his cosmology. As a person of his time, he would be totally convinced that, 1,250 years before him was this extraordinary character called Moses, and that the Israelites had been led out of slavery in the desert and crossed the Sinai Peninsula and entered the Promised Land. He would have believed those completely. But as he continued to grow, you'll see what he starts doing with that cosmology and that story. So he would take Moses, this great lawgiver, who had allegedly given them 613 precepts, and he would radically revamp this teaching. Although he's claiming, I did not come to abolish the law, but to bring it to fulfillment, look at how he actually fulfilled the law. Again and again and again, almost like a mantra, you hear him saying, you have heard that it was said to the people of old, A, B, C, but I say to you, X, Y, Z. And one by one, he would take some of the major teachings of Moses and the Torah, and he would turn them on their heads. Like the notion, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I say to you, love your enemies. He would take the notion of only men could divorce women in Jewish law. A woman could not divorce her husband, but a man could divorce his wife by simply saying, in the presence of a witness, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, 3 times, and she was gone. She had no recourse, and she could not initiate the process. In Roman law, a woman could, but in Jewish law, they couldn't. He takes that, and he said, they asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And he says, what did Moses tell you? They said, Moses allowed it. And Jesus said, yeah, only because of the hardness of your hearts. But I say to you, and he totally changed the rules. He took the law of the Sabbath, the single most important law of the 613, and he turned it on his head. He said the Sabbath was made for human beings. Human beings were not made for the Sabbath. In fact, they can pull it all together. At one stage he says, the law was made. The entire Torah was made for human beings. Humans were not made for Torah. Human beings come first. So he would radically revamp the teachings of Moses. So although he's buying into the cosmology and the fiction of this, heroic character called Moses and of the Exodus, although he may have bought that as part of his cosmology, he radically revamped what it meant to him. That's my second point. So my third point then is, what then really happened on Mount Tabor on Transfiguration? And the first thing that amazes me is, how in God's name did Jesus and the disciples recognize Moses and Elijah? Moses, if he lived, had been 1,250 years before. Elijah had been 800 years before. Photography wouldn't be invented until 1,800 years later. There were no graven images allowed. There was no visual representation of Moses or Elijah. So how did Jesus and the disciples, oh, there's Moses and there's Elijah? Was it like an AA meeting that Moses arrived and says, hi, my name is Moses, I'm an alcoholic. Hi, my name is Elijah, I'm an alcoholic. And everybody introduced him. Jesus, hi, I'm Jesus. I turned, water into wine. So is that how they kind of got together? There's something deeper there. And the deeper thing is this, that how many times have you had a dream where you're in your childhood home, but it's a totally different house? That nothing about it is the same as your house really was, but you know it's your home. So the details are totally kind of scrambled. But in the dream, you have this sense, this is my house that I grew up in. The very same thing happens in a vision. When you have a vision, you're not getting information via your sensory organs. It's not your eyes or ears or noses giving you information. It's perception via the unconscious. You're taking information from elsewhere. You're not dependent upon your senses. So in that sense, then, Jesus is aware in the vision that these characters represent, the myth of Moses, the reality of Elijah. Elijah was a real character. There's historical evidence for the existence of Elijah, and so they're having an encounter with that kind of energy. And so if I were to look at what's really happening there, I'd pick out 4 items. And the 4 items would be these. I think the Transfiguration, to use a Hindu kind of phrase, was Jesus was accessing the Akashic records. The Akashic records, according to Hinduism, are the record of everything that's ever happened anywhere in the cosmos, because God is a doting grandmother who likes to videotape everything her grandchildren are doing. So there's a record of everything you've ever said or seen or heard in your life. And you can access that. There are ways of accessing that record. Not just your own kind of past, but the past of anybody you're interested in. So for me, the first reason for Transfiguration is Jesus accessing the Akashic records of his people, of the Jewish lineage and the Jewish heritage, so he knows how to finalize his mission. He's on the last week of his life when this thing happens. He's trying to figure out, what he's bringing to the table for the last week. How does he conclude his own mission? So he's accessing these records. The second thing is, His experience is so profound that everybody else present can experience it as well. And that's not unusual. There's a modern phenomenon. You've heard of the near-death experience, where somebody has been pronounced clinically dead and they have this experience of going to the light, doing a life review, meeting dead family members, meeting some kind of an angelic being, but then coming back. There's another phenomenon which has just been written about over the last 10 or 15 years, and it's called a shared death experience. And it's where people who are attending to the dying person, whether they're nurses or hospice workers or family members who are watching somebody die, they participate in what the dying person's experience, and the room is filled with angelic beings and light and music and dead relatives who are coming to escort the dying person into the hereafter. It's been well authenticated at this stage. It's now been called shared death experiences. So in some senses, this was Jesus' shared death experience. This is going to happen just literally 1 week before he's crucified. So in some senses, the disciples are sharing in the death experience of Jesus, this encounter with those who've passed before. That would be the second reason for Transfiguration, it seems to me. The third reason is it was almost like a final pep talk. Jesus realizes that he's going to be dead within a week. The most horrific year, the most horrific week of his life lies ahead. He's going to be betrayed by one of them for 30 pieces of silver. He's going to be abandoned by the others. He's going to be dragged before the high priest and tried for religious heresy. He's then going to be dragged before the political authorities and tried for being an insurgent. He's going to be stripped, whipped, crowned with thorns, dragged across up to Calvary, stripped naked up there again, and crucified painfully, so badly so that he'll cry out, my God, why have you abandoned me? And he's aware of that. He really needs a pep talk, and that's the third reason why the Transfiguration is happening. And the fourth reason is he's pulling together now the streams of Jewish thought. The Jewish Bible is divided into 3 parts. There's an acronym, it's called Tanakh, T-N-K. T stands for Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, allegedly ascribed to Moses. The next part, N, stands for Nebiim, which means the prophetic works. And K stands for the Ketuvim, which means the wisdom writings, like the book of Job or the book of Ruth or the book of Wisdom. Now, in Israel at the time of Jesus, the Pharisees accepted all 3 as being the revealed word of God. They accepted the Torah, they accepted the prophets, and they accepted what were called the writings. The Sadducees did not accept the writings. The Sadducees, who were the priestly caste, only accepted the law and the prophets. So the fourth reason of the Transfiguration, I believe, is Jesus is encountering the law and the prophets. Moses is the archetype par excellence of the law. Elijah is the archetype par excellence of the prophetic lineage, and they're both meeting with him. So he's trying to bring together, in the last week of his life, the real meaning of the myth of Moses, the real notion of true prophecy, and the movement of religion from its sectarian origins to a global, unified love affair with the planet itself. That would be the fourth reason for the Transfiguration. That's my third point. And my fourth point would be this. Transfiguration in our times. And the first thing we have to realize is that the God that we worship and fear is a projection. It's a creation. We are not built in God's image and likeness. We've built God in our image and likeness. Now, I actually believe both parts are true, but the ways in which we are built in God's image and likeness have nothing got to do with our self-perception or our behavior towards each other. So we've created a God in our own image and likeness. We have written a drama in which we've given God a role, a character, a script, and a plot, and then we've believed our own story, and as it filled us with fear, and it allowed us to be genocidal maniacs in our relationships between religions. So we created this myth, we bought into this myth, and we followed through this myth. So the God that we worship mainly, particularly monotheistic religions, is a projection of the human shadow. We've created this monster, a monster who wiped out all of creation because he was angry, who killed all the firstborn of the Egyptians, a God who mandated this enslavement of African people, a God who continued to bless crusades and inquisition and sectarian religious violence. We've created this God. It's nothing got to do with who God is. This God is not a noun. Somebody said famously one time, God is not a noun, God is a verb. In other words, God is in action. God is not just static. But I believe that not only a God is a verb, God is a verb, not mainly in the past tense or the present tense, but in the future tense. To say that God was is just to consign God to the history books. It doesn't have any meaning. To say God is to kind of mistake God, or misidentify God with the current projections that we have of who God is. The valid way is to say God who will be. In fact, in the book of Exodus, in chapter 3, verse 14, when this God appears to Moses in the burning bush, and Moses wants to know what his name is, God's response is, in Hebrew, he says, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, which is often mistranslated as, I am who I am. There is no present tense of the verb to be in Hebrew. You have to get around it by something called predication without a verb. You cannot say I am in Hebrew. What God actually said was, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I will be whom I will be. Now, when we learn the prayers, I presume you might have learned it as well, the prayer I was taught as a little Catholic boy, the glory be to the Father. Do you know, did you pray that here? Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and never shall be, world without end. Amen. Now, that prayer is true. There's only one problem with it. We misinterpret it. We think that the God who was there in the beginning, the God who is there now, and the God who will be, is the same God. It's a static reality. It is not. God is the only one who is not static. God is the only one who is constantly changing. And by that I mean not the transcendence of God. We can say nothing about God's transcendence. It's an ineffable mystery. But we can say a lot about the immanence of God. God, as she reveals herself through her manifestations, through her creations. And that God is constantly changing. So to say the God who was, who is, and who will be, it's not about a static God who never changed from past to present to future. It's a God who is constantly changing from past to present to future. And that is the God that we have to create. We have to create a God in the future who is commensurate with the task ahead of us as a human race. As I said, every single myth has a purpose. It is to try to create inspiration and transformation. But there's this huge caveat that we don't seem to understand. Every single myth has a shelf life. It has a sell-by date. And if you continue to consume a myth who's outlived its shelf life and its sell-by date, you're going to get food poisoning, or maybe even be fatal. We continue to consume a myth of God, this cosmic psychopath who wiped life out in front of them. As long as we continue to consume that myth, we're poisoning ourselves. It was a myth that was adequate for previous times. It has long since outlived its usefulness. But fundamentalist religions of all stripes, particularly the monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they're trying to frame God in a past in which we projected a version of God who was a cosmic sociopath. That's the God we fear, that's the God we worship, and that's the God who continues to justify our genocidal activity on planet Earth. And so we need a totally new myth. When you understand mythology, you understand that there are three ways in which you can treat a myth. You can interpret it literally, that God is this ogre who committed all these crimes and justifies our continuing to commit these crimes. Or you can try to, interpret all this stuff symbolically. Somehow you can take the fact that God wiped out all of creation, or that Moses allegedly said, kill every man, every woman, every child, every ox, and every ass. You can try to, create that, interpret it symbolically. Good luck on that one. It's like the astronomers who were trying to understand the movement of the heavenly bodies. They had to create all these epicycles to account for the eccentricities of these bodies in the sky, to try to lick it into some kind of a formula. And finally they gave up and had to create a wholly different model. So we can continue to symbolically try to unpack these murderous crimes of God and Moses and try to make some kind of spiritual sense out of it, and we're not going to succeed. It's outlived its usefulness. And the third way to look at a myth is not to accept it literally or even symbolically. It is to park it as evidence of the evolution of the human species, a stage in our evolution, park it, and then create a brand new myth. A myth that's the result of a global dialogue between all the players, all the religions. A myth that's based on love of God and trust in God. A myth that's based on the realization that we're all, bite-sized piece of God, as Lawrence read for us this morning, each one of us representing a God herself. A myth that's based on that. A myth that will finally be able to deal with every aspect of the human journey. Industry, agriculture, the pharmaceutical industry, education of kids, spirituality, law, whatever it is. It must be able to account for all of these and infuse it with love and forgiveness for all. It must become a myth, to use the Hindu phrase, in which that allows us to say, as we meet every eventuality in life and every person in life, Namaste. The divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you.